Living alone in the woods can be scary to a lot of people. I'm sure there are many who find it difficult to be removed from technology and placed into isolation. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with technology or enjoying it. Far from it, actually. It's made life so much easier, and that can be often a good thing. All I'm trying to say is living in the mountains or wilderness isn't the easiest of lives to live, but it can be very rewarding and enjoyable for the right person. Hell, when I was younger, I was always excited to see new technology being developed, smartphones and video games. I always had to have the newest thing. That was my life growing up, all the way up to high school. And then, after getting a dead-end job punching in numbers on a keyboard, I decided it was time for a change. My friends and family told me I was insane for going through with this. Some even remarked that I wouldn't last very long and would come crawling back to civilization. They all acted like I was just going to wander into the woods and live in a tree or something. Quite the opposite. I had found a cabin for sale up north. Even though it was quite basic, it was exactly what I was looking for. Something I could make my own and not have to worry about other people getting in the way. Even though I was planning on living far out in the woods, I wasn't going to be totally cut off from society. There was a very small town not too far away from my cabin. It had a single gas station and a few shops here and there. Those shops are actually where I earn most of my money. Now I do some odd jobs for them, and the pay is more than enough for me to get by. The rest of my needs I get from nature itself. I use a wood-burning stove for heat and cooking. I have a small generator which provides some power to the lights in the fridge in the cabin, but that's about it. Half the time, I don't even use my lights. Instead, I just use oil lanterns. For water, I would have to haul it from a stream in the woods or collect rain and then boil it. For food, I have to go hunting or purchase what I need from one of the shops in town. The first week living there was a major shock to my system, going from being a cubicle monkey to immediately roughing it in the woods. You realize pretty quickly just how different things are. Lucky for me, my support system wasn't all negative. My father, who was an outdoorsman for a good portion of his life, gave me a lot of tips and advice regarding this matter. He had been very supportive. Even if it stemmed from a cliche point of view, he would often visit me once a month, just to enjoy the more simple life, as he liked to put it. By the end of the first year living there, I felt like I had come into my own. I had figured out what I needed to do to live comfortable. Don't get me wrong, I also had many mistakes along the way. I almost burned down the entire cabin twice and nearly had a tree fall on me. Overall though, I was very happy with my choice to move out here. That was until a few days ago. The day began and ended as if it were just another day of the week. I had gotten up and started a fire in my stove to provide some much needed heat. I ate breakfast and spent the morning chopping wood and gathering water. After that, I drove into town and helped out Jim at the store for a bit, before heading back home. As I drove along the trail back to my cabin, the sun had set, which made driving a little bit more difficult. I kept a close eye on the road in front of me, and after a few minutes, I finally arrived. I unloaded some supplies I had picked up and spent the evening making dinner. I had gone to bed at roughly around 10 p.m. About an hour or so later, I was startled awake by a noise echoing throughout my cabin. Someone had knocked on my door. I sat up in bed, wondering if I had simply dreamed the noise. I waited in the pitch dark of my bedroom, listening. Then, it sounded again. The knock sounded throughout my darkened cabin. I got out of bed and quickly put on some clothes. After I got dressed, I knelt down next to my bed and retrieved my shotgun. This might actually sound strange to you, but in my entire year of living out in the woods, I never had a visitor aside from people whom I knew were coming. I especially never had someone knock on my door this late at night. The odds were that it was just some camper or something who had simply gotten lost and was looking for help. As I approached my door, I couldn't help but feel some nervousness growing in the back of my mind. I was only a few feet away from my door, and I could already tell something was strange. You would think that someone who is needing help would be saying something. I began to think that whoever it was must have thought that nobody was home and moved on. I took a few more steps towards my door and waited. I was just about to turn around and head back to bed when 3 more knocks sounded against my door. When I heard this, I took a step back. My internal alarms were echoing in my head. I didn't know who it could be. I knew that any normal person wouldn't just be silently standing outside in the cold and knocking at random intervals. I clutched my shotgun in my hand and I walked over to the only window overlooking my front yard area. I tried my best to crane my neck to see towards the front door. Even though it was dark outside, the clear moonlight sky provided just enough light for me to see. There was nothing standing in front of my door. I scanned around the area to see if there were any signs of anybody walking around, and there were none. I rubbed my tired eyes and began walking back to bed. About halfway to my bedroom, 3 more knocks echoed. This time, they were much harder than before, as if whoever was on the other side was beginning to strike the door with force. Hearing this made me spin on my heels with my shotgun at the ready. Another 3 knocks. I could feel my hands starting to tremble as I stared with wide eyes. I wasn't sure who was outside my door, and I wasn't sure what to do. The next impact forcefully struck my door open. I stared in disbelief. It was tall, taller than my door frame. It raised a skinny hand with bony fingers and gripped the inside of the door. Kneeling down, it lowered its head to my level. The first thing I noticed were the eyes. They were big, like those aliens that you see everywhere. Its cheeks tapered its face to a pointed chin. It didn't seem to have a mouth. Well, as far as I could tell, it was now crouching in my doorframe and trying to come inside the cabin. I could feel my hands beginning to stiffen up. They gripped the shotgun tighter and tighter until it went off. The sudden noise sent a ringing in my ears. A brief flash of light filled the room, followed closely by the smoke from the blast. When the smoke cleared, that thing that had been standing in my doorway was nowhere to be seen. What I could see, however, was my truck sitting a few yards away. I stepped towards my door. I peeked my head out and looked around. There was no sign of whatever that thing was. Seeing the opportunity before me, I darted across the uneven ground and jumped into my truck. I started the truck up, and when the headlights came on, I could see it. It was standing on the roof of my cabin. It looked like some eerie statue at first. I quickly put my truck in reverse and turned around. I pulled onto the trail and floored the gas pedal. My truck started to bounce and rattle as I drove. Eventually, I came onto the main road, nearly crashing in the process. I drove towards the gas station, which thankfully stays open late. I dashed inside and demanded to use the phone. A teenager by the name of Jason, whom I met a few months before, gave me a look of panicked confusion. He handed me the phone, and I quickly dialed 911. It took the police nearly an hour to reach me. After spending another 30 minutes explaining to them that someone had tried to break into my cabin, we finally went there to investigate. I left my truck nearby as the officers examined the surrounding area with flashlights. After a few moments, they told me there was no sign of anyone or anything in my cabin or nearby. They told me they would file a report and to call them if anything happens. I said thank you, and they left. Once they did, I ran inside, grabbed a few of my essentials, and headed out myself. I stayed the night at my parents' house about an hour away. They were both equally surprised to find me sleeping on their couch when they got up. I explained to them that somebody had tried to break into my cabin, and they both shared looks of concern. The next day, I went back to the cabin to look around more closely. I didn't find much out of place, just the door and some holes in the wood for my shotgun. I always thought that living the simple life would be much more enjoyable than the life in the city, but as I stared at the massive, elongated footprints pressed into the mud that led off into the woods, I'm starting to think that working at an office isn't so bad after all. Before I start, I'll provide some background. This story takes place in the early 2000s, about 18 years ago, when I was still attending UND in Grand Forks, Minnesota, on my last fall semester. A group of my classmates and I were assigned a group project for our final. The final was to create a small movie, and each group was assigned a different genre. While some groups got comedy, romantic, and anime, we found ourselves with having to create a horror film. The members of our group were me, Ace, Altina, and Brooklyn. You know how back then when professors used to make random strangers and have them work together? Well, that's exactly what happened. The four of us were grouped together and given this project at the beginning of the semester, with a deadline set for the end of the semester. As we spent the semester sitting together and getting to know one another, we became really close friends, you can say. Even though it was hard to talk with Ace at first, always very quiet, sometimes a bit awkward. But once we were able to get past this, we got the ball rolling. It was almost like a joke on the professor. Despite being a group of random individuals with different backgrounds, we knew we were going to be able to pull this off. We brainstormed ideas for the film, talked about places where to shoot it, and planned for us to get the highest grade possible. Now, I said we all had different backgrounds because, well, Ace was native. Well, he is native. And I say this because he came up with the idea that had us all excited. He mentioned that he had always known of some spots at the Red Lake Reservation in Minnesota, especially in the forested areas in the Red Lake State Forest. He said these places were known for creepy legends, stories, and supposed reports of strange sightings, which made it perfect for our final. He said that maybe we should take a step further by actually going out to these locations, filming there, and maybe even camping there, all while recording our experiences in found footage style. Of course, this all grabbed our attention, so we all agreed that we would go camping and actually grab some real footage of these locations. So we ended up making plans to go, and we quickly organized everything, trying to do this as soon as possible, even though the project wasn't due until the end of the semester. Okay, so let me stop here and correct myself. It's not that Ace was awkward, it's just that, remember, he might have cultural differences and maybe that's why he spoke the way that he spoke, and even say certain things. He is part of the Chippewa tribe, and maybe it's not that he is awkward, he might just have different ways of interacting with people. Anyways, he began to open up to us about his rich native culture as we worked throughout the semester and brainstormed together. He talked to us about his family leaving the Red Lake Reservation for unknown reasons that he never mentioned. And well, he never looked back and ended up going to a public school and eventually got accepted to UND Grand Forks. Speaking of Minnesota, it was quite a journey for me personally. You see, I'm originally from Texas, but I ended up here when my parents separated a few years back. It was actually a big change. On the other hand, Tina and Brooke had been here their whole lives, so they were our local experts when it came to learning all there is about Minnesota. And Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, has a rich cultural landscape, including tribal lands that hold a significant place in its history. Among these tribal lands, a majority are by the Chippewa tribe, also known as the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people. One of the most tribal lands within the state is the Red Lake Reservation. This res stands out not only for its natural beauty, but also for it being strict prohibited against outsiders. The day had finally arrived, and we all agreed to embark on my truck. The same truck that actually faithfully followed me all the way from Texas. I began the trip by picking up Tina and Brooke. However, Ace simply said to pick him up on the street across from his house. He said it was because he didn't want his family suspecting of how close we were going to the Red Lake Res. So when we all got there, it was actually kind of funny. He looked like a hitchhiker with a single bag in hand. With Ace on board, we hit the road with Ace guiding us and telling us which way to go. As I was driving, I couldn't help but be curious about Ace and his connection to the res. So I leaned over and asked, Ace, so what's the deal about this Red Lake res? Why don't they allow outsiders? Ace remained fixed on the road ahead, and with a serious expression, he said, It's very rich in history, as my family's told me, and there's a lot of native land around these parts. The Red Lake Res is one of the oldest and most isolated reservations in Minnesota. It's actually been closed off to outsiders for a long time. And also, there are stories, legends even, about things that happen in the res, even in the woods, around the res itself. Brooke, sitting in the passenger seat behind us, turned to Ace and said, Hey Ace, what kind of things are we talking about here? I mean, are they just scary campfire stories, or is there something more to them? I quickly interrupted and said, Hey, get this on video. I can already see it. The beginning of the film. 4 buddies traveling through an isolated road to go camping. Tina quickly grabbed the camcorder and just started recording as we spoke. Ace then told Brooke, Some are just stories, just to scare kids at night and to have them behave good. But there's more. Well, actually, let me just say that there have been reports of strange sightings, unexplained sounds, and even strange things in these woods. My family always told me these stories, that people out in the woods will see things that they can't explain. Tina, who had been quietly listening from the backseat recording, interrupted by saying, You mean like flesh pedestrians? Do you have any personal stories or experiences about them? I could hear Brooke wanting to laugh. It's flesh pedestrians, dummy. And they both started laughing. What the hell is a flesh pedestrian? I said. Brooke stopped laughing and said, Oh, she actually means like skinwalkers, the supposed witches that shapeshift and hunt you down. But that's actually down there in Arizona, in the Navajo res. But everyone calls them by names. Some people even call them foreskin walkers. As soon as she said that, we all started laughing except Ace. And Ace, in a serious tone, said, There are some things that shouldn't be joked about, as I was told growing up. But let's just say that sometimes these woods have a way of making you question what's real and what's not. Tina then said, Alrighty then, sorry Chief Ace. We continue laughing as we continue our driving towards Red Lake State Forest. And after driving for about 30 minutes into the area, we came across a sign indicating a camping site with an arrow pointing to the left. However, Ace said that we should continue straight ahead. He mentioned knowing some less populated spots a few more miles down the road. And to be honest, that's exactly what we were hoping for, in order to create a distraction-free and scary setting for our movie. After about 30 minutes, Ace said to slow down and pull into a small open space coming up ahead. He told us he was very familiar with the area as the res is right next to the forest, and him and his friends as kids used to sneak away from the res for days. As we parked, I turned the ignition off and said, Well, is everyone ready? Brooke, looking at the surroundings, asked if this was an actual camping site. I looked at Ace. However, he quickly said that this was not our intended destination. He said that there should be clearings up ahead, about 5 minutes further into the area, that should be suitable for camping and filming. Of course, those 5 minutes felt like 15 minutes. When we finally arrived at a clearing, Brooke, looking around, said, Are we sure we can actually camp out here? This place looks a bit abandoned, doesn't it? It does seem a bit eerie. I mean, What do you expect from an isolated camping ground? Said Tina. Well, that's true, Brooke agreed. But let's just make sure we stay together. This place kinda gives me the creeps. I asked Ace to tell us more about the reservation, and he said, well, growing up, not many outsiders know about these woods. It's said to be one of the oldest parts of the res, even though we're not in the res itself. A lot of native people say that these woods belong to them. That's why it's untouched by modern development. But it also has a bunch of stories, strange occurrences, stories of spirits and unexplained things. Some of the elders in the res always warned us of wandering away too far into the woods, because apparently witches lived out here. Witches? I said. Brooke then interrupted and said, he means skinwalkers. They just don't use that word because of their beliefs. Isn't that right, Ace? Ace then nodded and said, you are correct. My people always said that simply by thinking of them, saying their name. There are forces out there who are listening, to see, who calls on them. Tina then told Ace, but isn't that what you're doing right now? Ace then responded and said that they always go get blessings by his elders when they come to visit. So he is basically non-existent to these things. We all started unpacking, which included food, tents, camping gear, and of course, some liquor. After everything was set up with the surrounding area, we decided to explore around the woods a bit for our project. The concept of our film was to create a cliché found footage style film, similar to the Blair Witch Project, with Ace and me playing the lead characters. Tina and Brooke took charge of operating the camera and the tripods and making appearances here and there. Now that I look back, can't deny it was a bit cheesy, but it turned out to be a lot of fun. After what seemed like a few hours of shooting, Ace suggested that we head back to campsite, as it was gonna get dark pretty soon, and we didn't want to get lost. He said it gets dark quote-unquote sooner out here in the deep woods because the trees cover the sun a lot more. Now, this is when shit first started, and maybe at this point, we should have just left. But we didn't, I guess because we didn't see it like such a big deal. When we got back to our campsite, we noticed that some of our stuff had been moved around, and some of our supplies had disappeared. It left us feeling uneasy about the situation, but Ace helped us calm down by suggesting that it was most likely a deer or some birds. So we brushed it off and we started a campfire, and we all sat around talking to each other about plans after graduation. As the night progressed and we started talking more, I reached into my pocket, hoping that my weed wasn't missing, that I had brought with me. With a smirk, I pulled it out and held it up for everyone to see. See? Never leave your stash behind. Even though some sort of animal had gone through our stuff, I'm glad the weed was still with me. This right here is the cure for all things. It'll make this camping experience even more unforgettable. So let me just say that there are a few things I always carry in my pocket. My stash, my keys, my wallet, and well, back then cell phones weren't as common as they are now, so I didn't carry a cell phone with me the way I do now. Ace responded, man, I'm in. Let's see what you got here. It better not be no cheap sticks and twigs. I looked at Tina and Brooke. Ladies, what about y'all? They exchanged glances, then shook their heads in unison. Nah, we're good, Tina replied. We'll leave the adventure to you two. With a chuckle, Ace and I wrote some papers. As soon as we got to talking and laughing, I told Ace, yeah, this isn't anything like that Chippewa smoking stuff, huh? He just started laughing as Brooke and Tina just started talking between themselves. After a few more minutes of joking and laughing and making fun of Tina's Crocs, a foul smell, resembling a mix of rotten milk and vomit, came with such an intensity that was almost unbearable. Brooke couldn't help but say, which one of you farted? It smells like burnt shit. We all started laughing, attributing the smell to the effects of being both stoned and drunk. However, the laughing quickly died down when we all heard a rustling in the bushes behind our tents. Panic set in as Ace grabbed a knife, stood up, and carefully walked over and scanned the tree line, ready for whatever might be out there. As we sat there in our somewhat different states of either drunk or being high, Tina, in her drunkenness, said, "Way to go, Chief Ace." We all started laughing as she attempted to lighten the mood, but Ace didn't say anything, and the humor quickly faded as we continued to listen to the rustling in the bushes, unsure what was out there moving, and with Ace just standing there. After what felt like 5 minutes, maybe because of how high I was, Ace came back and leaned in. "You know," he began, "sometimes a dead animal nearby can bring foul smells like that. Maybe it's just some wildlife scavenging nearby. Well, shit. Literally, shit. What kind of animal out there is playing a prank on us by shitting near us?" We all started laughing, and after a few more hours, we decided to call it a night and crawled into our tents. Throughout the night, I woke up to the sound of crunching of leaves around me, like if somebody was walking around the tent, and the steps got closer to my tent, and that's when I heard Ace. "I can see you, even in the dark." I'm not sure why, but those words creeped me out, so I told him to shut the fuck up, and to stop trying to scare me, and to go back to sleep. He simply walked away to the right side of my tent, which is where his was at. The next morning, we woke up with slight hangovers and feeling dehydrated. It was cloudy, unlike the sunny day before. I crawled out of my tent, and Ace was sitting in the camp chair at the edge of the fire, poking the ashes with a stick. Lost in thought, I walked over to him. "Ace, you almost had me last night, dude. I'm not gonna lie, you kinda freaked me out a little bit." But he just stayed quiet, and when I approached him to ask him if he was alright, he looked up and said he was fine. He asked if I wanted to go exploring into the woods, and I asked why. "Yeah, he's weird," I thought in my head. He simply replied by saying just curious, and even though I found it weird, I agreed. We decided not to wake Tina and Brooke, since they both admitted they are both cranky when disturbed from their sleep. Of course, we gotta start the morning right. We rolled some joints and disappeared into the woods, high as fuck. Exploring nature was fun, joking and laughing along the way, even though Ace was on the quiet side and a bit awkward sometimes. Him being drunk or high was like being a normal person. We reached the top of a hill, sat down, and chilled for a bit. Overlooking part of the woods, I took some pictures with my quick snap camera, because the scenery was beautiful. Ace then asked me if I heard the screeches and sounds last night. I hadn't, but he described them as being pretty loud. I brushed it off as maybe a fox or something, but something did catch my eye. He seemed creeped out, and I'm not sure if it was his awkwardness, him feeling the effects of the weed, or something, but it was strange to see him like this. When I asked him if that's why he was so quiet in the morning, he confirmed it, and said he felt strange about it. "Man, fuck that. Are you joking or are you being serious?" I said. "All this crazy shit that's been going on has me on edge." We started walking back to the campsite, and after about 15 minutes of walking, I kid you not, we came across a different smell. The smell of decomposing flesh. "There goes that shitty smell again," I said. As we kept walking, we came across a dead bird, completely skinned and mutilated. I looked down at it wondering who or what could have done this. I then recorded the dead bird, and because the more raw, the better, right? "Look at this shit, man. What do you think?" As Ace got closer, and as I was recording and talking in the background, I kid you not, we heard rustling from deeper into the trees beside us. And that's when we both looked at each other and fucking ran back to the campsite, terrified. As we arrived at the campground, I told Tina and Brooke what happened, and to my surprise, they believed me. Maybe because of all the weird stuff going on. So we sat on the chairs talking about the weird shit that's been happening. I showed them the recording of the dead bird we came across, hoping that the sound we heard could be heard in the background. but there was nothing. Again, we didn't have iPhones or good cameras at our fingertips. We had what you call camcorders, blurry, and not so high-def tech like you all have now. Ace also told him that he heard some noises last night, and I could tell everyone was worried, but they didn't want to show it. Now that I remember all this, it felt like one of those situations where we all knew some weird shit was going on, but nobody wanted to admit it. So we decided to leave first thing tomorrow morning. So we ended up filming for another 2 hours, but then we called it an early day because Ace said he wasn't feeling too good. We also didn't really explore anymore and just stayed around the campsite. Except this time, as we gathered around the campfire at night, Tina had her camcorder on trying to get as many moments as possible. She was recording as we were talking to each other, almost like an interview style of her asking me about the bird that I had found earlier, and asking Ace about the voices he heard at night. As it started to get darker, all 4 of us started to get scared. We actually talked about leaving at that moment, but Ace said it was too dark to get back to the truck, and so we ended up just deciding to stick together. We even talked about sleeping in the same tent, but that was impossible as they were not big enough. So with the light of the campfire, we just got the tents closer to each other, helping us feel a little bit more safe, as we agreed to leave as soon as the sun comes out. Later that evening, as I was inside my tent, I heard the sound of footsteps beside my tent. Ace called out in a voice that sent chills down my spine. He said, "Are you scared of it?" I turned my head towards where the voice was coming from, and it was coming from my right side where Ace's tent was at. I thought maybe he was trying to pull a prank on us, so I simply said, "Why are you talking like that, dude?" And he said, "I can see you, even in the dark. We've been here long before you arrived." "What the fuck are you talking about, man?" I said, but he didn't answer, and I could tell he was just standing there. And without saying anything, he turned back to his tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Not once did I hear his tent zip open and close, so even though I was scared as fuck, I decided to step out of the tent to see what Ace was doing. As I came out, everything was pitch black. The fire had died down as my eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. I took about 2 or 3 steps towards Ace's tent when suddenly I felt a cold hand clamp down on my shoulder, sending shivers down my spine. My heart started pounding in my chest as I turned around expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nobody, just empty darkness. Creeped the fuck out, I hurried towards Ace's tent, my eyes starting to see more in the dark. I reached out to shake the fabric of his tent, urging him to come out. "Get out, Ace," my voice with urgency, as at this point I was desperately freaking out. "Ace, Brooke, Tina, get up." A few seconds passed and they started stumbling out of their tents. I wasted no time in telling them, "We need to get the fuck out of here now. There's something out here. We have to leave." Tina and Brooke were just standing there looking at me confused, with Ace asking me what's going on. "There's somebody out here, man. They were walking around our tents a few minutes ago, saying some things." That's when Brooke asked me if I was drinking. I almost flipped out, but then a silence fell over the forest. No crickets chirped. There was no wind blowing through the trees. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And this caught everybody's attention. Complete silence. That's when Ace said, "Let's go, right now." And Ace just started walking towards the tree line. It might be too dark, but I'm pretty sure it's straight this way. At this point, we just started speed walking, and we left every single thing behind. The cameras, the tripods, our belongings. the tents, the chairs, everything. And then the forest came back alive with a bunch of different sounds. And at that point, we started running. I could hear Tina and Brooke starting to cry. I know we weren't that far away from the truck, but God, it felt forever. And then, the scariest thing in my life, we started hearing sounds of footsteps, not human, but something else. The sound of a bunch of different footsteps running alongside all of us, like the sound of dogs racing beside us. I then told Tina and Brooke to keep their eyes closed and keep running straight ahead. And that's when I felt it. Something behind us. I could hear somebody or something running directly behind me, like the sound of dogs or horses galloping behind us, close enough that it was literally sending shivers down my spine. Like imagine somebody running directly behind you, breathing down your neck in the middle of the night. Every step felt like an eternity. I was for sure that at any moment I was going to be overtaken by whatever was behind me. But finally, we reached the truck, and without hesitation, we all got in and sped off. And as I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see plenty of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, watching us as we sped away. As we left the forest, a heavy silence filled the air. The only sound that was going on was the truck's engine. We didn't even say anything to each other, as Tina and Brooke were crying. Fuck, I was crying myself. As we neared the town, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that still lingered in the back of my head. Turning to Ace, who was sitting beside me, I said, "What the fuck happened back there?" Ace seemed to be lost in thought. After about a minute, he spoke, and the only thing he said was, "We need to get a cleansing from a medicine man. They have took notice." His words sent a chill down my spine. Nothing else happened after that. Maybe in another post, I'll go more into detail about what the medicine man told us, but I'll end it with this. I know what I saw years ago in the Red Lake Forest. Stay away from the tribal grounds of the Red Lake Res. There's some creepy shit going on around the woods of that res. Don't go near it. There's a reason why it's closed off, and that's why only they limit who can visit or live in the res. If you stay in Minnesota, don't ever venture out into the woods. I know these things are still out there. My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it, for a few reasons, that is. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But to be honest, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about a ghost, aliens, and you think to yourself, this isn't real. They're making it up. Or they're mistaken. Or they're crazy. Or something along those lines. You just can't believe it until something happens. Something that brings it all together. Connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was real. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it Skinwalker, after an old Navajo tale his grandfather told him. But I'm gonna tell you the story exactly the same way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, he would tell me. Coyotes. We would kill them for $50 a skin. They lived on a dairy farm in Ohio. We would do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we would come on a deer and kill it. The landlord didn't mind it, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking, 'cause we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We would cut through the woods. That's when we came up on it. Blood everywhere, splatter on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We had seen it sometimes. They can scavenge and start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this was nothing like that. See, when a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they'll do it the right way. They'll pick one that's weak or sick or old or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, some place it can get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its own throat is gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick and it's clean. But that wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, nor would a pack of wolves, because they'll get too much of a fight. There were three bodies, just torn apart. A leg here, a torso there. A predator doesn't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. Whatever had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of corpses, torn bodies, and we think it's something we gotta take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, but I wasn't gonna leave him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. He was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun he could use. Dad had a shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't difficult either. We just followed the blood. It seemed like that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises, and I've been in a lot of woods my whole life. I've been all over the world, and I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Deer, fox, rabbits, raccoons, birds, just scared. Keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock, except the fox and some birds. Nothing was supposed to even be awake, but they weren't just awake, they were moving. I saw a flock of birds that night fly straight into trees just trying to get out of there. We came up on a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple thinking it was what we were looking for, but then we saw they were running towards us, and they ran right past us. Didn't even notice. Then some of the deer did the same. Then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together that maybe whatever we were tracking, it wasn't something we were supposed to see, and maybe it wasn't something we could kill. I don't even know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go towards trouble, to fight, and knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land, but where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. It's almost like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds wet nearly tore out my damn throat once. All that means is that it's quick and hard to hit. So we follow the tracks and it doesn't take us long to find out where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there. Not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there, sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards, and we hear this noise. A screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One was a high-pitched screech. Another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards and we hear the sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down, and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's just one." He tells me it's most likely a single feral dog, most likely rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it till it don't move anymore. Then we slit its throat. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side so I can see what it is. I wish to this day I had it. It was leaning over a carcass, tears off its flesh, and throws what it doesn't nibble aside. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey. It was hunched over. Its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that. Nothing, and I mean nothing, made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, made this shrill cry, and jumped on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him. I started shooting it with the 22 point blank, but it barely bled the thing. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even acknowledge that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin. Then it moved up. It tore off his throat. It tore off his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripped off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones in that tube in your neck, then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ends up in this thing's shoulder, and my dad ends up on my back. I'm running, and by God, I'm running faster than I ever run before or after, and it's following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we've been in. I'm heading towards the landlord's house. 'cause it's half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I just ain't looking back. Finally, I trip into gravel. I look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and I cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What is that on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly, we hear it, screeching. He grabs me. My dad gets thrown on the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, 'cause I think we can still save him, somehow. But my dad had been gone before I ever picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside and they're locking doors and getting guns. The landlord's asking me, what happened? But I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous out there. All the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there, but in 15 minutes. We look outside and see it walk in front of the fire they made. Don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape. Suddenly, something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's a dog. My landlord's dog. Just the body though, not his head or legs. We start pushing things in front of doors and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. We hear metal and glass just get ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent, like it was before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol. No sooner did I cock the hammer back did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because now it was inside the house. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hand through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that. Put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand off, clean. That only pissed it off though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other side doing the same. That wood wasn't just going to hold it, so someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly, the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing, and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to that door, what was left of it. The sun was up before they got me off of it. They put me in a hospital for a while. A lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long time. When I got back home, I got a job from the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about that thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I then asked, right away, what the police told him. The story that they told was that it was a wild animal, most likely a wolf, or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I then asked them how they could say that when they had the hand. He looks at me, stunned. He tells me that the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked, drove into a tree, and died on impact. The hand was never found, most likely taken away by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand that existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear, that looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. The cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away, but I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't even if I had the whole goddamn US Army on my back. But that was a lie. When my mother died, I don't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He went to those woods, and he never came back. The FBI was called. They did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't actually looking. I had to get one of the agents drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing, but that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he got a napkin and he wrote, "The Rake." I didn't know what he was talking about until I looked it up on the internet. But to be honest, I wish I would have rather not known. I had been a hunter for most of my life. Leading up to this incident, the smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night because I have seen everything there is to be scared of. I have seen bears the size of a small car and animals so vicious they would kill anything that moved. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I heard the tales of the Skinwalker, the Wendigo, and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert in tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He had something about him. It was a rule. I remember it because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I'm not sure, but something about it always had me on edge. One day, it was winter, and I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped at my front door. When he came in, he saw my pack supplies and my rifle, and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a raft of anger as he dragged me to a wall and got into my face. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" His spit went all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he did not want to share. It was the same face you would expect a child to make if they were dumped in the middle of nowhere. The same face of fear that you see in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed them off and got to the door saying I was going to go hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin this trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you start hunting, you get adjusted to it, and then when you go on breaks, you actually miss it. As I got into my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle is prone to outbursts, as I should mention. He's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, however. What was so bad about hunting in the winter? The spot I had planned was an isolated one. It was a huge forest area, which I had not been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I would have to use it after all those years out in the forest. When I arrived, the crisp, cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood above the rest. It was called the Forest Star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must have been an injured animal or something like that, but the droplets were small and almost even. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup, and I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was around 5:30 p.m. I had around 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, and so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from its case, I heard scampering. Shaking it off, I took my spot and waited. As I stood there, time almost slowed down. I was in a precise focus and was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw though. Out came 2 small bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dry blood. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I had never seen anything like it. Many different scenarios ran through my head. I was thinking, had a hunter shot both of them in the eyes and managed to not kill them? But the scenarios I was coming up with seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I know I had obviously hit it. But it didn't seem scared nor fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my side. I was freaked out and decided that I would cook dinner and go to bed early. When I scampered around my pack, I pulled out a can of beans. I grabbed a pot and started a fire and began cooking them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I thought it was maybe a small deer, and I brushed it off as I sat and relaxed. I was thinking about the deer, and I started to chalk it up to the fact I must have not hit it deep enough, and the deer must have been in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, however, it was more loud, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and went out of my tent. My fire burned low, and in the distance I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards it when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my gut was literally twisted. My mind was anxious and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big solid red eyes. They were just orbs hovering. When I realized, I stood frozen. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was so much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers were twisted and uneven, but the worst part, it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down in its unnatural eyes. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it started to make sounds. The sounds of a baby crying. It was horrible. The sounds of unnatural cries filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumple, and so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it stood there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sounds of that baby crying weren't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it back to camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and I rushed to my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest. As my mind started to close, I felt my cerebral melting. as anything I tried to do would not happen. It was like sleep paralysis. As I stood there, I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed the door shut and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the keys in the ignition. My mind felt fried as I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. And then, before I could back out, it stood up on its legs and it repeated a voice I recognized.
You did not escape. The forest are mine.
It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a terrible shrieking noise that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cry started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that fucking place. When I raced home, I barged into the door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved my door and locked it and ran into my kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a small glass of scotch. So, you saw what I saw, didn't you, Anthony? I couldn't form a single word. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and said, "What you saw out there is my rule that I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible that even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then, I will never go hunting during winter." I finally mustered a sentence. What was it? He took a small sip before sitting me down. "You saw something called Urbarak. It's an old, ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it never are the same again, but some never even come home. I was lucky." My uncle sort of sniffled as he told me about his encounter with Urbarak when I was 23. My father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my father called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yelled out before he fell silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood was running from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby. My uncle stopped and had to take a second before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed. It ran after me, Anthony, on 2 legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. I was stuck in the forest for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around. As I tried to make it out, I finally arrived at a road and was taken in by the police. No trace was found of my father, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It belonged to my father. What was strange about it, it was mixed with his tears. Then my uncle finally stood up. "Fear it, for it now knows who you are." Those were his last words. He left my house and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner's inspection said it was an aneurysm, but I'm not sure that is the truth. I'm 50 years old now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Urbarak is. Maybe I can kill him. So, beware of Urbarak, for he lurks in the forest, out in the cold. I love camping, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on nice, flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. Hell, it was subtle. I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment, I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded almost like a female, but strange enough, I just couldn't tell. Please help, it continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So, I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from being odd to very, very weird. The police actually told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and maybe needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it, do not respond, and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I didn't ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering, "Help," and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went outside to check and no one was there, but the voice continued from a distance. "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person or listen to the police, who were concerned for my safety. But then, I heard another, different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding.
Quiet.
The other voice demanded.
No one's going to help you.
Once I heard that, I was pretty sure someone was in trouble, so I called the police again. When I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack up my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that the two voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said that a woman could be in serious trouble and that it was their job to help her, but they still refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods, sir." They actually seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then, a growling.
Quiet. No one's coming.
It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead became a coward. So I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased. Just like that. No cries, no whispers, and no commands. Even the owls and crickets went away. Nothing but dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around, a full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still, nothing. I thought of calling the police again, then chuckled to myself. I found it strange, but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anyone out there. Regardless, I was still creeped out, so I packed my things and finally left the campsite. I didn't know why the police, of all people, were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger, and we all failed them. To be honest though, when I heard the voice the very first time, I did think it was a joke. When I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. However, when I heard it again, for the fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my own house, I became very, very concerned. I was the first to notice an extra person had joined our group. I counted 6 of us sitting around the campfire, but I knew we had left home with 5. The 6th person had joined us somewhere along the way, but where and when exactly, I could not be sure. All the glowing faces looked familiar, like I had known them all for a lifetime. That was why it took so long to find the man out of place. I had to go through the faces one by one. I went through my history with them, recounting how I met them, how I knew them. I fit each one into my memories like puzzle pieces. First, there was Mark. He was sitting next to Sarah, talking with her as always. I met Mark and Sarah 6 years ago in the 10th grade. Mark and I played wide receiver together on the school football team. Sarah was a cheerleader, and Mark always had a thing for her. The 3 of us started hanging out after games, Mark flirting non-stop, and Sarah always hilariously rebuking him after a while. Then there was Ben. We had been best friends since the 1st grade, ever since we bumped heads playing tag during recess. He had his arm around his longtime girlfriend, Justine. She started at our school when she moved from Chicago in the 7th grade. Ben sat next to her in class, and soon she became a part of our group at that time. She was quiet and shy when she first arrived, but once we got to know her, she opened up. She was one of the coolest and nicest people you could ever get to meet. She had also become close with Sarah in the past few years. And then, there was the 6th face, the piece that did not fit. I stared at him, and his name escaped me. That is, if I ever had it in my memory banks in the first place. He looked familiar, but I could not place him in my memories. But why, if I recognized him? Why could I not remember his name? Why did he sit among us, acting as if he belonged here? He stared at Mark and Sarah as they chatted. He started laughing when they would laugh, smile when they smiled. I couldn't figure it out. The question burned in my head. How had he, a stranger, joined our little group without any of us noticing something amiss? Hey, Porter. Ben pulled me from my thoughts. Your head up in the clouds or something? I was just telling Justine about our 5th grade teacher. What was his name again? Mr. Smith, I said. Oh yeah, Mr. Smith. I was telling Justine how you could rile that guy up like nobody else could. Remember that one time you gave your homework printed in yellow ink? Ben and Justine laughed. Yeah, I remember, I said. I can still see the steam coming out of his ears. They laughed again, and I semi-joined in. When I glanced the strange man's way, he was watching us, grinning, just watching, part of the reason he had flown under the radar. I was struck with the sense that he was studying us. My skin started to crawl. Ben drained his beer and threw the empty can in the cooler. Well, I gotta take a leak, he said and walked into the woods, swallowed up by the darkness. You really know how to push people's buttons when you want to, huh? Justine said. I shrugged. I was having trouble focusing on the conversation. The weight of the situation, the reality of it, was starting to hit me. A strange man had attached himself to our group unnoticed, and who the fuck knew what his motivations were? Questions raced through my mind, none I could answer. How had no one else noticed yet? Why had it taken me so long to notice? Was I going insane? Am I forgetting things and forgot this one friend of ours? The strange man then stood with jerkiness. I gotta take a leak, he said. It was the first time I heard him speak. He spoke in a strange way. It sounded as if he had to force the words from his throat. He walked with an awkward gait, and like Ben, disappeared behind the dark veil of the trees. No one else flinched. Justine kept talking. I always loved the long relationship you and Ben have. It was so hard moving cities and leaving all my old friends behind. I mean, I can't complain too much. I wouldn't have met Ben and all you guys otherwise. Justine, don't you see what's going on here? Huh? You're telling me you haven't noticed? Notice what, Porter? What are you talking about? Who was that guy? I gestured to the vacated spot the strange man left behind. Oh, him? He's, what's his name? She trailed off. She frowned into the fire. I could see her mind ticking over, and her eyes twinkle with concern. I knew I wasn't going crazy. I don't know, she said. Who is it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We stared at each other. Maybe... Justine was cut off. An ear-piercing screech came from the woods. It sounded like a shrill, injured cat. A large cat. The sound split in the air and cut our conversations short. A blanket of silence fell over the 4 of us. Only the crackling campfire persisted. The woods were still and quiet. The fuck was that? Mark broke the silence. I don't know, Sarah said. I have never quite heard an animal like that before. Sounded like some fucked up mountain lion, Justine said. Have you ever heard anything like that before? I shook my head. My fingers tingled with adrenaline. Ben was still in the woods, and the strange man was out there with them. Dread filled my gut. There's no mountain lions out here, Mark said. Most likely an elk. They can make some creepy sounds. Sarah agreed. Justine bit her lip and scanned the woods. It's okay. I think Mark's right, I said to her, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Mark and Sarah had started up their conversation again. when the strange man came out of the woods. They paid him no mind. I was hoping something would have triggered in them by now, but they were oblivious. The strange man took a beer from the cooler. He fumbled with it, struggling with the tab. It was as if he had never opened the can before. When he finally got it open, he sat, beer in hand, and continued to watch Mark and Sarah, a thin smile on his face. He never did take a sip. I watched them from across the campfire, his head wavering behind the heat. I touched on what made me uneasy about this strange man, aside from the fact that he had managed to infiltrate our group without any of us noticing for a long time. He moved with jerkiness and awkwardness, like a newborn animal. Nothing he did was well practiced. It made everything he did look like an act, an imitation. I didn't make the connection at the time, but I should have seen this man was not quite human. But at the moment I wasn't sure what to think. I guess I just thought he was a freak. I considered calling him out, then and there. I wanted to ask him just what the fuck he was doing, but I'll admit, I was a little scared. I had visions of this guy being some horrific serial killer, and I didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he was armed. I didn't want to push him into doing something drastic that got all of us killed. As time went by without any sign of Ben, I became convinced the strange man had done something to him. I watched them plan and marking his next target. Anger sprouted from my fear, and I started to see red. I needed to stop him. We used an axe to chop firewood for our campfire, and it was leaning against my seat. This man was dangerous. I was sure of it. I convinced myself I needed to do something before another one of us was next. I clutched at the axe's handle. Justine touched my arm. "Porter, where's Ben? I'm getting nervous." "It's okay," I lied, patting her hand. "I'm sure everything is okay." I stood with the axe in hand. "I'm gonna go get some more firewood," I announced, more awkward than I hoped. Okay, dude," Mark said. "Porter?" Justine's voice. Speaking up was a mistake. I had drawn the attention of the strange man. I walked past him, trying to act as nonchalant as possible, but I was never a good actor. He watched me the whole way. He kept his glare on me as I reached the area of the woods, and as he looked back, his head rotated around an unnatural distance. That was enough to chill my spine. I was hoping he would turn around to look away and give me an opening, but he never did. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. I never saw him stand up and walk over to me. I never even saw him move a single muscle. But just like that, in an instant, he was standing in front of me, inches away from my face. It was as if he had teleported. A metallic smell stung my nose. The strange man stunk of blood and copper. The axe trembled in my hand. Any thought of actually using it fled my mind. I locked into place, my skin covered in goosebumps. Power radiated off of him. He spoke to me.
"Get some firewood,"
he said in his forced tone, and he smiled wide. At that moment, Ben emerged from the woods. "Ben," Justine cried. "Jesus," Ben said as Justine squeezed him. "Did you guys hear that cat thing?" "We think it was an elk," Mark said. "Where were you? Why did you take so long?" Justine asked. "I guess I wandered too far off, and I lost sight of the campfire. It took me a bit to find my way back. For a second I thought I was going to have to freeze my ass off out there alone tonight." The relief washed over my body like a wave, crashing into my muscles. I felt each one relax. At least Ben was safe. I looked for the strange man, but he was gone. He somehow slinked away while I was distracted. He was good at going undetected when he wanted to. My thoughts turned to getting out of there. Even though Ben was unharmed, that guy was still trouble. I started back towards the group and caught the middle of their conversation. "Yeah, who was that guy?" Ben said. "I thought he was with you guys," Sarah said. "Yeah, isn't he your friend?" Mark added. "I thought he drove over with you three." No," Ben said. "I don't know him." The panic spread over everyone's faces. They were finally feeling what I was feeling. The realization had set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, "before he comes back." "Yes, please," Justine said. "We have to leave now. That guy was a freak, right, Porter?" I explained to them how I noticed he was the odd man out when we were sitting around the campfire. I explained the odd behavior, and they all agreed the guy was strange and possibly dangerous. None of us could pinpoint exactly when he had joined the group. He had slipped unnoticed and unaccounted for. It was strange. We packed our tents in record time. We trekked the 15 minutes to our vehicles through dark woods, flashlights in hand. We heard the screech of the elk again, if it was an elk, which I had my doubts about now, and we took some comfort from the fact it sounded further away. Even so, we picked up our pace for the final stretch of the walk. I felt like I could finally relax behind the wheel and lock doors of my SUV. Justine and Ben sat in the back, while Mark and Sarah followed behind us in Mark's old beaten-up vehicle. We were heading out of the woodland and were planning to shack up in a motel for the night before heading home in the morning. I thought we were free and clear. We worked our way around the dark roads that snaked through woods. I let a smile open up my face when we finally reached the exit road. It was an arrow-straight stretch of asphalt that split through the last few miles of woodland. I pressed on the gas. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of the woods, and I think Mark was feeling the same way because he sat close on my rear bumper. I remember thinking, at least we'll have a strange tale to tell after all this. I didn't think it was about to turn into a horror story. The trees and the dashed lines on the road blurred past us. My headlights reached out for the endless road, and my meter needled its way towards 100 miles per hour. I don't know what possessed me to go that fast, and I wish Mark hadn't followed my lead. It was a mistake. The strange man appeared from behind a tree. He walked into the middle of my lane. I slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The next sequence of events happened so fast it played like a slideshow in my mind. The tires screeched and there was a smell of burning rubber. The strange man folded over my vehicle and got sent flying down the road. He skated across the pavement on his back, moving with such speed it looked like he was gliding on ice. More tires screeching. Mark flew past in the opposite lane, fishtailing. He fought it, and for a moment I thought he had it saved, but the vehicle hooked right into the trees. The sickening sound of crunching metal sounded in the air. Mark's car slammed into a tree, driver's side first, sending fragments of glass and metal flying. The car bounded off one tree and into another. The front passenger side impacted this time. The front light exploded, and the passenger side cavity caved in, sending a wheel bounding into the woods. The crumpled heap of a car came to a rest. Justine was the first out the door, crying out Sarah's name. Ben went after her, and I followed after him. Everything felt surreal as shock coursed through my body. It was as if I was watching through a screen. I floated over the asphalt as Justine and Ben sprinted towards the streaming wreckage, the crash scene dimly lit by my SUV's one remaining headlight. There are two screams I'll never forget. They imprinted themselves on my brain, and I'm gonna hear their echoes at night forever. The first one I heard was when I was 13. It came from my mother. It flooded the house, splashing off the walls. I ran out of my room to see her crumple at the front door, with two police officers standing by. They had notified her that her eldest son, my brother, had died. The second came from Justine when she saw what was waiting for us in the vehicle. Mark was unrecognizable. He was a shattered mess of bone, skin, and blood, blended and intertwined with the crumpled steel. Sarah was blinking slowly, her breathing labored, her one arm shattered, broken in too many pieces to count. Her legs crushed at knees from the front of the vehicle, which crumpled back into her leg space. Her legs would have been flat if I could see them. Justine turned away and fell to her knees, with her face buried in her hands. Ben tried to comfort her, but he had to turn away and throw up on the side of the road. I pulled out my phone and struggled to dial 911. With my fingers shaking, I kept pressing the wrong numbers. My voice was small and distant as I explained what happened to the operator. She told me to stay on the line, but as I looked down the road, I dropped my phone. The strange man was standing there. His grin reached from ear to ear, showing a grandstand of his teeth. His shoulders shrugged up and down as if he was laughing. In fact, the fucker was laughing. If I were not in shock, I would have gone after him right there and then. I would have torn his heart, if he has one, right from its chest. But all I could do was stare, struggling to keep the tears behind my eyes. The strange man started for the woods. I watched them go, and I watched them change. I saw it. I know I did. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. This was real. I saw him. Shapeshift. I saw. It's true. Form. We were not dealing with something human that night. After countless hours of research, I believe I saw what others have called the goat man. Its horns were sticking out, uneven from its head, with rows of sharp teeth, and walking upright, like a man, with an awkward gait. It vanished into the shrouded woods. It's been 8 months since that night. I only seen my friends a handful of times since then. Our relationships have shattered and are left in ruin. All we are now to each other is a stark reminder of that night. Mark is dead. Sarah survived, but as a triple amputee. Justine and Ben broke up. And here I am, rugged with a scraggly beard and hair that has been uncut, after spending every sleepless night researching this monster I saw that night, the goat man. I'm going back to those woods. I'm coming for the goat man, and I'm not stopping until one of us is dead. I grew up in K-Town on the res. One of the guys I knew in school was named Daniel. He was a true jokester. Never a serious moment, always pulling pranks. One day I see him in the cafeteria, and I go sit at his table cause it looks like he's troubled. I sat down and was like, "Hey, what's up?" The interrupted story that poured out of him terrified me. Daniel said that he was up at a family sheep camp. He said he was there alone when a coyote that looked as large as a bear came out of hiding behind some pine trees. It looked at Daniel, smiled, and said,
"I'm going to get you, Daniel."
Daniel said that when he heard this, he almost peed on himself and ran close to 13 miles back to town. as fast as he could. He said that by the time he reached town, it was dark, and he could hear the coyote yelling far behind him.
I'm gonna get you, Daniel.
He made it home, jumped in bed and stayed awake in fright for the rest of the night. Then, he said that throughout the night, he could hear that same voice outside his window.
I'm gonna get you, Daniel.
He told me the story the next day. It was up to that point the only time I had encountered Daniel to be completely stone cold serious. I offer that maybe one of the medicine men in town can help him. But Daniel was done with the subject from then on. I'm gonna log off till tomorrow night. You all can message me there if anyone is interested in knowing more about this. Let me give you some advice if you ever go camping in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, or even near the Navajo res. The smell of copper and blood means there is a skinwalker near. My grandfather told me a story once. He said how he went camping in the woods with 5 friends, and they sat around a fire. He nonchalantly counted heads, and there were 6 of them. And he said there was a copper smell in the air. And after a while, they went into the camper, and the 6th guy stood over every one and stared at them for hours. And as he was awake, the whole time he was debating on doing something. But he said that eventually the 6th guy just ended up leaving them. My grandfather then said that he didn't go back to sleep, and that he told his friends the next morning, and they decided to pack up everything and leave. My grandfather tells me that skinwalkers will usually approach you, study you, watch your behavior, in order to blend in with your group when you're out in the woods. So be careful out there if you ever go camping with a group of friends. As you're sitting around the campfire, sleeping, having fun, drinking a beer, always count those who are around you. Make sure nobody or something sneaks in. When we first moved into my grandpa's old cabin, I had a few obvious reasons to be afraid. First of all, I was 12 years old. Second, we moved in because our old house had burned down while we were away on vacation. And finally, my grandpa was a sick, old man. Not in the sense that he had some sort of illness. Well, I suppose he did. But that illness is what ended up killing him, giving us that forsaken cabin. But in the sense that he was batshit insane. When I was younger, my grandfather would tell me horrible stories about the cabin he lived in and the woods around it. He would tell me stories of the natives who lived in the forest, something about them being cursed by God for worshipping false gods, being turned into the trees themselves, if you look closely, while not looking at all. My sadistic grandpa would say that you can still see the trees move, and if you listen carefully, you could even hear them singing their worship for their false gods. I, of course, assumed he was just crazy and was trying to scare me from wandering off in the woods, and possibly also to motivate me to go to church. But still, since I was 8 freaking years old and all, I would sometimes see a branch twitch in the wind, or hear the faint noise of a distant animal, and I would worry it was one of the natives that my grandpa would go crazy over. But of course, the stories didn't finish there. Not only was this cabin the original home to a clan of witches, but also home to a cannibal and at least 2 serial killers, and a family that used to worship the devil. To make the whole illusion complete, my grandpa made up a story how he won the cabin in a game of Russian roulette against one of the previous owners. All of these stories never truly scared me. They terrified me when I thought about one of them too much, but I was actually never fearful of the stories being true. Well, except for one story that my grandfather told me. He said before the cabin was built that the natives used the area for human sacrifices, offering up human flesh and blood not only for their gods, but for creatures they believed that dwelled in the woods. These creatures, my grandfather would say, were known by many names in all kinds of folklore: Wendigos, the Jersey Devil, demons, White Walkers, Skinwalkers, the Goat Man. But my grandpa would always call them Marchar de Poule. It's French for Skinwalker. These beings of divine or mystical power were known to feed off anything from human flesh and blood to a human soul, or even fear itself. The Skinwalker would stalk their prey throughout the woods they inhabited if the sacrifice given was not enough to feed their hunger. They always attacked groups of people, never a single person. That's the reason why my grandfather said that he lived alone. The Skinwalkers would play with their food, often turning their form to look human to trick and torment anyone they sought to feed off, before finally killing them. My grandfather said once they finished feeding off of anyone unlucky enough, they would peel the skin from bone and wear it like a suit, often visiting the families of the dead to further torment mankind. The reason the story scared me so much was because I truly believed I saw one. When I was 8, I was playing in the backyard of the cabin. My grandfather sitting on the back porch, smoking his pipe and humming some old tune. He told me he was going to go inside and fetch some more tobacco, and he warned me not to go too close to the woods. I nodded and kept doing whatever I was doing at the time. After a few minutes, I felt the air around me turn cold, and everything seemed to get heavier, and I began to smell something like pennies, and the cold grew stronger. I realized it smelled exactly like blood. I felt a chill run up my spine, and I nearly gagged on the metallic taste that lingered in my mouth. I was about to stand and move back inside the cabin when I heard a soft laugh faintly beyond the tree line. I realized it sounded just like my own laugh, but now I was already scared. So scared I could hardly move at all. The smell of copper grew so strong that I thought I might pass out, but then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I swallowed my spit and slowly turned to see a little boy standing just in front of the forest. I was almost relieved until I saw his eyes. They were pure white with no pupil, just pure white. I felt my knees buckle under me and my lip began to quiver when it smiled at me. But when it smiled, the teeth were missing, and it was just a set of black, rotting gums that I could smell from several yards away. It lurked ahead, doubling over, seeming to hack and gag and laugh all at the same time. Then, it bent backward, placing its hands on the ground, and looked at me from between its legs. I swear I could hear bones break and crack as it began to crawl backwards into the forest, all the while making this gagging, laughing sound. That's when I passed out and wet my pants. I woke up a few minutes later from my grandfather gently shaking me up. The smell had magically disappeared, and there was no evidence of the creature I had saw just a few minutes ago. I told my grandfather what I had saw, and he grew so pale he almost looked like the little boy's eyes. He drove me back to my house, not saying a word the whole way. I told my parents what happened, and I was assured I must have just fell asleep and dreamed the whole thing. So eventually, That's what I convinced myself had happened. It still haunted my dreams, but I was convinced it was my imagination, and my grandfather's old stories were just getting to me. But then, we moved into my grandfather's cabin. Since we had lost all of our belongings in the fire, we had nothing to unpack. Even though I had convinced myself that I dreamed what I saw all those years ago, I was still worried about living there for an extended period of time. My parents let me watch some movies we rented while they were cleaning the cabin that had been vacant since my grandfather died when I was 10. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up on the couch a bit surprised I had fallen asleep for so long. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I became aware of the tapping that was coming from the front door, almost as if someone was knocking with their fingertips. Even though I had no real idea what it was, I got up to check on it. Then, I smelled it again, that heavy, thick, bloody smell that had lingered in the back of my mind for 4 years. It got so cold so fast I could see my own breath. I felt my heart thumping in my chest, and that same shiver run up my spine. I was so scared in that moment I thought I was going to break down and start crying. Then the tapping stopped. Then the smell grew worse. Beyond the front door I heard something gag and cough and laugh at the same time. My knees buckled and my lip quivered just like they did the first time. I became vaguely aware that I was slowly backing away from the door when I tripped and fell back onto the couch. Then I passed out again. Again, like the first time, I woke up from a hand gently shaking me away. I woke up and realized it was my dad looking down at me. It looked like he was out of breath, but I was so relieved he was there, and that the tapping on the door was all a dream. I then smiled at him, and he tried to do the same, but he only managed to get one side of his lips curled up. I was about to ask what was wrong when he scooped me up in his arms and told me in a hoarse voice that he was carrying me to my bed. His arms were so cold they felt like metal, but I didn't care, and I was already falling asleep again. He brought me to my room and laid me down in bed. His eyes were already closed and my mind was about to drift off. He leaned down and I felt his cold breath on my ear as my mind shut down and he pulled away, and just before I fell back into sweet sleep, I heard my dad begin to cough. A few hours passed and I woke up again. I grew scared when I remembered the tapping on the door, but soon felt better when I remembered that it must have been a dream, and was thankful my dad woke me up to carry me to my room. I sat up in bed, still just a bit scared. I looked around my room, realizing that this was the first time I actually seen it since I had fallen asleep on the couch, before I even had a chance to check out my new room. It was almost pitch black, so I could hardly see anything. I gazed over to the wall and saw a mirror. It was hard to see, but I could make out my face and my upper body. I smiled at myself and saw my reflection smile back at me. Satisfied, I went back to sleep. In the morning, my dad again gently shook me awake. He said good morning and asked what I wanted for breakfast. I told him what I wanted and then thanked him for carrying me to the bed the night before. He looked at me, confused, and told me that he didn't, but I wasn't listening anymore, because when I looked at the wall, just as I had looked at it last night, I realized there wasn't a mirror in my room, only a window. Do you love Native American legends? Have you heard of the Goat Man? No? Then please, allow me to enlighten you. I heard the legend when a power outage on our reservation made us decide to have a fire. As we all know, nothing goes better with a good fire than a good story. That's where I learned about the goat man. The legend goes that they shapeshift. They love human forms most of all, which is what makes them so dangerous. It's also said that if you find a bone of one, take a picture and keep it in your house. It will wait. For what though, you may ask? The answer is they wait for you to leave. Once you leave, they ransack the place until they find what you took from them. There was even an incident about that night that I heard of, where some people met the goat man face to face. It was a night like the one I was experiencing. Some men had decided to have a fire in the desert, and they told some stories about it. Then a stranger walked out of the desert and took a seat, never speaking a word. No one really got a good look at the stranger. One man brought up the legend of the goat man, causing the stranger to listen a little more closely. At the end, the other men nervously laughed, and the stranger stayed silent. The man decided to go back to their homes and put out the fire. They didn't have enough room for the stranger, and they figured he could hitchhike back to town. They had just left when they saw something chasing after their truck. Afraid, they sped up, and the creature sped up its pursuit as well. When it reached the truck, it flipped over and dragged 3 men off into the night. What happened to them? Well, they were never found. So here I am, to warn you, and to be careful of the goat man. They can shapeshift, didn't I tell you? That homeless man begging for change that you encounter on your way home tonight could be one, or your boss, teacher, or even your friend. This happened about a week and a half ago. I live in Washington State. I'm a 14-year-old male. I'm homeschooled, so I don't leave the house much, and I live with my mom and my dad. It was March 7, 2022, at about 12 a.m. I was just listening to the old Jenna Marbles and Julian podcast from like 3 years ago and playing some video games. I was kind of tired, and I had just finished eating a snack. So I went to go brush my teeth and wash my face. I did all my business in the bathroom and came back to my room. When I opened the door, my cat was up in his cat tower, which is right next to my window, and his back was arched up. His hair on his back was all up, and he was hissing, which I had never heard him do. I look out the window, and standing there is my dad. This gave me a relief for a second, until I realized it wasn't my dad. It was taller than my dad, and its smile was weirdly big. My dad never just smiles at me, and he's never came up to my window before. What the fuck is that? I said as I ran out my room, crying and shaking, obviously, because I never seen anything like that before. I went to my mom, who was sleeping on the couch, and I shook her awake. I told her to go check if my dad was in the bedroom, and she asked why. And I told her I would tell her after she checked, and indeed, he was sleeping in the bedroom. I told her what happened, and she sort of believed me, but sort of didn't. So she went into my room and checked out my window. Whatever it was gone. She checked all the other windows and doors, and nothing was there. She even grabbed my cat, and we slept on the couch that night, all together. Today was the first day I was able to go back into my room, March 17th, and I still haven't told my dad about it. I have no idea what it was that I saw, but the only thing I can think of is that it was a skinwalker. Anyway, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this, and I'm still terrified that I'm gonna end up seeing it again. It's crazy. I looked behind my shoulder like 10 times while writing this. What the fuck? Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least a general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this theme or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday, and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities, and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night, and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us three were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area, and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually, we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home. Here's what happened. My cousin is sleeping over. He's the same age as me. We're both 13 at this time. We're in my room, talking and hanging out. It is around maybe 11 p.m. It is a pleasant summer evening, so my window is wide open. It's also pretty dark outside, and my dad is in the living room watching TV. But as always, he's dozed off on the couch. My mom has already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but we're not ready yet to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and slam shut. We think it's my dad. My mom, she tells us the next day she hears footsteps on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom, so she naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she realizes that she's unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still, in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only this time more loud. It wakes up my dad, and he comes to my bedroom to check on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him we were by ourselves, and that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face, he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He then leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we could do is shrug. The next morning, my mom tells us about what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she then hears what sounds like a horse galloping by her bedroom window. She then has all of us pray, and now, every year, we hike up the mountain to a high point and we pray for protection from evil. This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say, an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limp and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body. I was only 17 at the time. On this specific night, I woke up feeling thirsty. I'm just lying there, staring into the dark, and deciding if it's worth the effort to get up and get something to drink. I'm sure we all been in that situation plenty of times before. So tonight, when you're in bed and you're questioning if you should get up and get some water, remember this story. So all I can hear is the clock ticking down the hallway and the muted silence. It's just way too quiet. I check the time on my cell phone. It's a few minutes short of 2:30 a.m. I then decide to sit up and get out the bed. I then make my way towards the door of my bedroom. It's really dark. I go down the hallway towards the kitchen. As I get out to the living room, I chance to look to my right and in the direction of the front door to the house. The only light is coming from a street light that is down at the end of the property and not all that far away. There, at the inside of the door, inside the house, I see this figure standing there. Its face at first appears human, then serpent-like, and then back to human, as if it can't decide how it wants to present itself to me. For some reason, I'm just standing there taking this all in. I'm not afraid, but I don't feel like I have any control over my senses either. And I'm not sure if I could move or have said anything, even if I wanted to, which at the time, I can't say I did. As the two of us are standing face to face, he assumes his human features. His face is fully painted, a thick stripe of black across his eyes, and the rest white. He has a feather woven into the hair at the top of his head. He looks young, not much older than me. He is bare-chested, not real muscular, but definitely cut. His torso is painted red. His lower half is covered in what looks to be khaki-colored pants, well worn and faded, cut off and frayed just below the knees. He is barefooted, but his wrists and ankles are wrapped with animal skin of some sort. It is hairy and light, colored like that of a coyote. He doesn't say anything to me, not aloud anyway, but I do hear his words in my head, although for the life of me, I can't remember any of it. It's as if he at the same time, with this cold stare of his, is pinching away layers of my memory. I do remember wondering why he is in my house, and having the idea that he was expecting to find someone else. Just then, without even thinking about it, my cell phone in my hand, I begin dialing 911. With the phone ringing, I look back to the painted stranger. He gives me a thin smile and vanishes through the door, which by the way is closed and locked. To the other side, I hear what sounds like a horse galloping away. I move over to the door and pull it open. I see this figure taking long strides across my yard, away from the light and out into the street. There's a car parked on the other side. He goes around to the passenger side, ducks down and into the car, and it drives off. It all happens in a matter of seconds. I then realize there's a police operator talking back to me from the phone. I tell her there was someone in my house, but I leave out the part about his changing appearance and leaving through a closed door. The operator, or whoever she was, tells me not to worry about it. She says that I'm not the first caller of this kind on this night. She tells me to say a prayer, telling me that she too is Navajo and to go back to bed and that I won't be bothered by it anymore. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in South Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important, but when I was staying there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. They said that years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we would wake up and be expected to stand near the front of our cells, while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of those routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off. When the guard saw this, he pulled over another guard to help him check it out. They found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. And this man was wearing the skin of the other man over him. But apparently, it looked like a real monster. The scariest thing was that the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into the prison. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty scary stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker. But that's what the prison called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help out that the guy never talked apparently. Anyways, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone here felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear, to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now, onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently, he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even been able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. He would expect the Skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on the edge about it. And every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes, you will find your cellmate swinging in front of the bunk, strung up around the neck by his pants. Sometimes, you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like, if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way too. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or people just going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything. But every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were, quote, shipped off or, quote, transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were nighttime occurrences. Short and a loud burst of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my wall on a regular occasion. One time, near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was really outside my call. And the footsteps, everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly, fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it wasn't human-like, and it was very fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated those fucking footsteps. And I agree. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago. I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way, I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing though, was when I woke up one night to him, somehow, snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. And the worst part of all of this was that he was coming back in to our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him, just left, and he seemed fine with it, and so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gate, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, similar to how he was for the last week or so. I shook my head. not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence, and I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, looking at the other inmates, and twitching manically